Hey, Mike here, and I've got some really exciting news to share. So, over the past while, I've been working on something totally new, and I'm finally ready to start talking about it. And it is that I have just launched a brand new plugin company called Carve Audio. Now, the goal behind Carve Audio is simple. It's to make plugins that sound incredible, inspire creativity, and make your workflow faster without overcomplicating things. And I'm kicking things off with our very first release, which is called the Smashburger Compressor. I was really hungry when I came up with the name. Anyway, the Smashburger isn't your typical compressor. It's designed to give you punch, warmth, and glue all in one simple tool, combining transient shaping, tube tone, tape drive, and easy parallel control so that you can make your mixes sound finished faster. It's available now at carveaudio.com, and to celebrate the launch, we've got some very special limited time introductory pricing where you can get it for just $29. We also have a 14-day free trial too, so if you want to try it, you can do that as well. So if you're ready to add some extra punch to your tracks, make sure to check it out at carveaudio.com. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike Indivina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Shane Slack, and if you're not familiar with Shane, Shane is a Emmy-nominated mastering engineer. He is also a mixing engineer. He works in post-production. He has a studio called Motown, and he's done a bunch of work with various companies like Apple TV, Netflix, Disney+. He's worked on projects like Ted Lasso, Guardians of the Galaxy, NCIS LA, Umbrella Academy, and a whole bunch more. And in today's episode, we're focusing mainly on the mastering side of things because that is where Shane started his production journey. And as he talks about in this interview, learning mastering has passed on so many skills and mindset shifts in terms of how he approaches things like production or mixing. So I thought it would be good to just dig into some of that stuff because it gives us the high-level overview of what we need to be considering with all of our productions. So even if you're not a mastering engineer, we need to learn from what a mastering engineer is going to do with our music to make sure that everything we do in production and mixing is going to sound good. And ultimately make sure that the whole project sounds better, it works better, and that there's less revisions and we get better quality work in the end, right? And in this episode, we dig into some pretty technical stuff. Like Shane has learned from some of the biggest mastering engineers out there, like Bob Katz, who are very scientific with their way of approaching music. And that has definitely passed on to Shane. You can tell in this interview, he understands this stuff at a level that is much deeper than a lot of people. But he does a great job of trying to simplify it and help us understand how things like phase correlation can play such a big part in how good something sounds in the end. He brings this really interesting perspective that I don't think anyone else has talked about on this podcast as far as like really diving deep into the weeds of phase and making adjustments to phase throughout the entire process, but not just the phase kind of nerdiness of it, but like understanding how, even if you don't get that side of things, at a basic level, what can we do with arrangements and mixing decisions to make sure that phase is kind of taken care of? So he has this technical topic, but he really simplifies it so that even if you don't care about that stuff, you need to know about it, but also he'll share how to actually take care of it at an easier level. So yeah, this is a really interesting episode, and we definitely dive deep into that as far as things like arrangement decisions, how to properly double track your instruments so that you can make sure that your phase correlations are right, how to check things in mono to make sure that everything's going to translate properly. Because that is one of the biggest things that tends to go sideways when people don't pay attention to phase, is that you listen to your music on a little Bluetooth speaker or a mono system, and half the stuff in your mix disappears. So Shane shares how we can make sure that everything will translate better, and so that ultimately people get to enjoy your music no matter where they listen to it. So yeah, with that said, let's just jump into this interview. Shane Slack, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How's it going today, man?
It's going good. How's it going with you?
Doing great. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and how you got into all this stuff, can you give us that background?
Yeah, so my name is Shane, obviously. My company is called Motown. I'm actually one of the immersive mixing engineers for Columbia Sony Music, as well as a mastering engineer for Motown, as well as Hacienda Mastering. Motown is located in Los Angeles. Hacienda is located in Orlando, Florida, headed by my mentor and amazing Grammy-nominated mastering savant, Matt Davis. I've been in this industry for probably like 10 years now. I went to school in Orlando. I went to Valencia College, did their sound and music technology program, got kind of sniped by Matt and Bob Katz out there, who are both my mentors that I am gracious to have been blessed to learn under. And my route in this whole industry is a little bit non-conventional. I learned how to master before I learned how to mix, before I learned how to produce. And that has kind of tailored me towards solutions that many people are not really familiar with in terms of how do I approach a mix, how do I approach a master, how do I master production, because it's almost akin to the Abbey Road style of learning that they had back in the day, where they would never, you would not be able to go into the mixing stage until you started the mastering, and back then it was for vinyl and cutting engineers. Then you would go to the mixing, and then you go to the tracking. And what that does is it creates this modality where you're being informed and you're being cognizant of things that are happening down the pipeline. So yeah, a little bit of a unique experience for me.
That's awesome, man. So let's just talk. That was one of my questions that I was curious to dig into, is that I knew you learned about mastering first. So as far as, you know, how that's impacted everything down the road, like, yeah, what are some of those advantages you feel you've gained as a result of learning mastering first?
Honestly, the biggest advantage, in my personal opinion, is when a lot of the mastering guys, where we see this a lot with producers and mixing, like, while they are very much focused on creating the creative product and creating like this big picture, mastering is all about the fine details. And one of the things that I was really blessed with being a mastering engineer first before becoming a mixing or producer myself was I got to really understand a lot of the mistakes and shortcomings that a lot of these producers and engineers whose material that we were doing was being we were correct. So one of the things was definitely in terms of intelligibility, in terms of like understanding loudness, but not from a typical, like, just a standard LUFS way, but from a psychoacoustic perception and how that's going to translate to the listener. And it's really interesting how psychoacoustic, like, reinforcement and psychoacoustic like phenomena in terms of music and making it translate to the listener and to the medium is kind of like this dark art to a lot of mixing and producing engineers. And the mastering engineers, it's so funny. I Even when I was coming in, they would call it the dark art, and like it would almost feel like this elusive secret club of things that, like, they would only certain people would let in, which might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but like it really did feel like that. But now, because of that modality and because of like looking at a lot of artists and engineers like common mistakes, it really gave me a leg up when I started translating back, I guess, downstream to mixing and producing, to be like, okay, I'm aware of like what the mastering guy is going to be looking for. I'm aware of what the cutting engineer is going to be looking for. I'm aware of things beyond just the standard like monocompatibility. It's like monocompatibility and phase cohesion with bass in order for it to translate onto big like subsystems. I'm more worried about, all right, but the intelligibility of this mid-range, will this translate to monophonic playback systems like beat pods or your AirPods? Will it also translate down to like, the worst headphones you could imagine and the biggest sound systems you could imagine as well? Even in terms of like psychoacoustic, like spectral masking, when I'm now producing kind of similar to how a Carnegie chart works in one hand, and in the other hand, it's like everything has its own frequency range. And so it's like where you'll see like people with double track guitars, maybe I'll double track guitars, and yes, they're playing the same notes, but I'm not playing them in the same register. And that will just make, I'll send my productions out to some of these clients, and they'll be like, whoa, like you double track these and it sounds much more massive. Like I've double tracked them and they just always sounded like it sounded fuller, but when I fold it down or when I listen back, it just always didn't feel as right. But like you just seem to get it right. And again, that just comes from my experience as a mastering engineer, having to correct for those things and having to deal with like, having to do like actual phase rotations in my EQ and not like a normal standard EQ. It's like I have an EQ that actually lets me choose point by point where to flip the phase and how many degrees out of phase or in phase I want it to be, just to correct for that. And now it's just like, background knowledge for me now.
That's wild, man. I feel like there's so much that we could dig into with what you just said there alone. Yeah. So I guess, one of the big things to take from that, I guess, is like you said, you've seen so many different ways that translation can fall apart in mastering. And so, yeah, you shared a great example of the double tracking. I'm assuming when you're talking about that, you're just talking about like maybe playing like inversions of the chords or, different spots on the neck, that kind of thing, just to make it a little bit different.
Yeah, that could be one solution to that. I like what I really like to do myself is I like recently I just went and did a tracking session. We played the normal standard like 5 chords, which are the power chords, on in one register in E standard. We didn't double track that and drop D. And it's the same power chords, it's the same thing, but because there's a different register that's happening, it's being very much more complementary, and you're not introducing as deleterious of phasing issues that you can get with double tracking. Because what happens a lot in double tracking with guitars is there is shifts in performance. There is, how hard you're actually hitting your strings, and the dynamicism that you're introducing in your playing is not standard. There's also micro timing fluctuations that can happen. When I was like learning and doing it for myself, I was just like, wouldn't it just be better if we, instead of just voicing these all in the same register and introducing like such a deleterious phase shift if I'm not hitting it correctly, what if I just made it in a slightly lower register, not too drastic of a register, not a huge delta, but just a just a little bit of a difference. And kind of led me to where I'm at today in
Yeah.
some regards when it comes to my producing.
That's very cool. I think that's a great tip. So the other big thing that you said was a frequent problem as well was phase correction, and that was something you'd have to do a lot. And you talked about almost like EQing phase, and so maybe you could dive into that a little bit too. Like, what does that actually look like, and what should people who are recording their own music be paying attention to make sure that all of that stuff is coming through properly?
Yeah, so what's happening a lot in a lot of modern productions, especially with the double tracking and everything else, is we really care about stereo width a lot, and we care about like that big, huge sounding like sound stage that can happen. Now, we look at that as sum and difference in my mastering modality, but like the problem is that we're introducing way too many differences, and we're causing issues that will come back in playback downstream or after delivery that you may not be aware of. Like, again, for example, let's say your music's being played at a club, those club systems are mostly monophonic. They are not stereophonic. And let's say you have this blistering guitar solo, or more commonly, let's just say you have this wide infra bass or sub bass that's happening, and it just sounds nice and wide in the studio. And then you get it back to color playback systems, and it just feels like it's nearly disappearing. It's something that we need to be very cognizant of, but also it's something that we're not as aware, and we're not really taught to be aware of in like, YouTube University or, traditional education about these audio. In the mastering circles, that's such a huge deal. That's a very huge deal. Most of our days is just correcting for those things. I have one EQ plugin, which was actually the first plugin I ever bought by DMG, called Equilibrium. Kind of looks like Fab Filter, but what it does have is very modular and deep controls. One of them is in its FIR setting, you can introduce an EQ point, and you could actually rotate the phase of that EQ point. So let's just say you wanted to do a boost at 3K, but instead of that being 180 degrees out of phase, we can get with some minimum phase or shifts, you can, let's say, all right, do it 3000K or do a 3K boost, and let's just rotate it maybe like 60 degrees. Just cause the phase shift to be like slightly 60 degrees. What happens then? Oh, it's not only back in line, but now I'm getting more of these like upper partials of other elements that I didn't even realize there was being masked or being phased out. That's something that once you hear it and once you've applied it, it really does change it. Now, for producers and engineers that are like, in the bedroom and all that stuff, one of the things I always say is do a mono check, but do a mono check in a way, a little bit in a more extended way. When people think about the mono check, they're just like, okay, all the important elements are in mono and they're coming through. That's only half the equation. You should still be able to get like a Z-axis front back depth that comes with your mono mix, just like they used to have in the 60s with a lot of their mono mixes. And that will kind of dictate to you whether or not you are making intelligent choices that will create that three-dimensional effect and will translate into width and depth further downstream.
Complex thing to explain. So yeah.
Yeah, it's very complex because we again from mono compatibility we're just taught that like, okay, everything should be right here, or like everything should be translatable and all the important elements, and that's cool and that's important, but like we're losing that z axis, we're losing that depth because we're not making choices in our productions and our engineerings to emphasize that depth. Now with analog equipment, everybody says that like, oh my god, it sounds three-dimensional, it sounds 3D and all that stuff, because the way that the signal is split inside an analog processor will create that depth and will create that biasing against the original signal. So it's like, hey, let's say you have a guitar track, or let's just say you have a bass track. Hey, let's just say you have any sort of track, and it goes down to mono. It needs to have that depth still. It's not just about it being cohesive, and it doesn't have to be 100% cohesive, but like as long as it appears there, that's only half the battle. You need that front to back, that depth. And then once you take it out, it's like, whoa, like, playing it back on the PMCs or on the keys or the Genelecs that I have, I'm like, whoa, dude.
Are you saying that like with the mono compatibility check, like I think when it comes to mono, there's a lot of differing opinions on this. Some people will say nobody's listening in mono anymore, except you prove that wrong with clubs, and still like some phones and stuff like that. But so there are some people that are just like stereo is king. Who cares about mono? I'm not even going to listen to mono. And then there's the opposite end of people who are like mono extremists and they try to get everything perfect in mono, but then it falls apart when it's in stereo. So
yeah.
How much of that compatibility is related to panning versus frequencies or phase, I guess?
But that's a really good question. So honestly, most of the people who say they don't really care about mono compatibility are usually not the people who ultimately are sending it to a mastering engineer, because your mastering engineer does care about mono compatibility, at least in some frequencies. And to tie into that, there's some stuff where panning is kind of like 33% of the issue. It's really the frequencies and introducing the differences. A lot of people tend to reach for like imagers to create stereo width. The problem with an imager is it does introduce a lot of phase decorrelation, and it introduces all these little micro delays into the frequency spectrum. And again, that difference between left and right is what we perceive psychoacoustically as width. So the more different the left signal is from the right signal, the wider we're interpreting it. The problem is that by using like these one-stop gap solutions, such as an imager and all that stuff, it will introduce deleterious effects. And then like, when you go to these playback systems, all of a sudden they're disappearing. It's not that we don't want stereo width. And it's not that we don't want wide sounding mixes. Everybody loves a wide mix. I love wide mixes. The issue is that I want these mixes to work no matter the format, no matter the medium. So for a lot of engineers and producers right now, what I would really recommend is, instead of reaching for an imager, let's say you have a guitar pan left, pan right, and you have a guitar bus, do left right EQ. Do a lot of left right EQ. Maybe even bus on your bus level, if you're doing something parallel and you have a parallel compressor, maybe after doing that parallel compression, you do some mid-side EQ. Maybe emphasize a little bit more of the sides. And funny enough, with mid-side EQ, that's where we see a lot of phase decorrelation can happen, because if you're just doing it, let's say you're doing this is signal A and signal B, and you just do a copy of signal A, and then you just do a little bit of mid-side EQ on it, the issue is that there's not enough of a biasing difference between the original signal and this copied signal where you're just doing this mid-side and you're introducing a lot of phase shifts. What's really good is, let's say you have a little bit of harmonics or nonlinear artifacts or nonlinear processing that's happening on this copy of the signal, and then you do mid-side. What's happening is that like with that compressor example I was giving, for example, it's introducing a lot of harmonics. It's now there's a dynamic shift that's happening between the original signal, which has its original dynamicism, versus this one where it may have been, compressed maybe like 2, or what I like to do is 1.7 ratio, and with, I like to use Magic Defi for that. Those harmonics, I can now shape those harmonics back into the original signal on the mid side, fold them in, it works in mono. But now when you go back to stereo, it's like wide. We also see that a lot in bass sound design. That's happening right now is they'll bust out their basses to a subgroup, and they'll use like either a limiter or any sort of nonlinear processor to introduce harmonics and distortions, and then they will shape those extra added harmonics to be cohesive with the original signal. So like I would just go ahead and like see like people who will do like, again, that mid-side EQ, but then they're pushing the mid on that parallel distorted bass, pushing the side a bit. And again, that original signal's still there, but now you got this depth and this width that's happening after the fact.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it definitely is taking. I mean, to some degree, it also sounds like it's complicating the process a lot more. It's not just as simple as making like, recording a track and then EQing it like normal or whatever. Like you're really factoring in the phase side of things. Now, I can see some people listening to this and hearing you talk about mid-side EQ or left-right EQ, and them kind of blindly doing this, maybe, like not sure what to do. Yeah. So like, what should people be listening for, and how can they actually be like identifying when things are out of phase and it's causing problems?
Again, one is the mono check. 2 is when you're doing any mid-side EQ, try to start with very low ratios. I have a tolerance limit of about 3 dB to 4.5 dB. Usually that's not going to introduce too deleterious of effects. Just go ahead and like do little notches. Like if you even have like Pro Q or your Logic EQ or anything else like that, set that range instead of it being 12 or 30 dB high. Just go down to like 3 dB. Do it low. Another thing is it really does take a matter of critical listening. And critical listening for these elements is something that has to be learned through experience. So if I use the example of like a vocal and a vocal sack, I'm taking that little small notch, and again, like maybe it's only like a 0.5 notch, and I'm just moving it ever so slightly. And then I'm waiting till I hear like, oh, I hear that depth again. I hear the depth between that vocal stack again, right there. If I just take a little bit of that out, and it just has to be a little small amount. Or conversely, if I'm doing a little bit of a boost on my guitar group, I'll be like, if I do like this mid boost right here around like, 1.7K, I'm really rehearing a little bit more of that pick attack from all the guitars more cohesively together and all that stuff. It's almost like I would rather demonstrate it.
Of course, yeah. No, I definitely think it's one of those things where it's like demonstration is the best way to actually hear the difference. Yeah. So I'm gonna ask this question because I think there's probably people that are skeptics of a lot of this. Everyone's always questioning all the advice they hear. So back in the day, like people were working on consoles and they had whatever they had in front of them. There wasn't the ability to use linear phase EQs. They weren't using plugins. They weren't using MS EQ or MS processing in general on like anything. That was mainly a mastering thing, but people were still getting great results. So, what do you have to say to that? Like, how do you feel like music from back in the day has changed to what we're hearing now, and why is it so much more important now?
Part of the reason that music back then, where we didn't have to worry about, or we weren't thinking about all these like very upper echelon level tools that we have access to, like we got great sounding records back then because there was just a better principle and fundamentals that were being applied. With YouTube University and everything else that's happening, there's so much misinformation and so much like misgivings that are given about, analog or digital or how to mic things up that, for a new producer and for a new musician or engineer, there's just, how do you weed through all of that? How do you cut through all the chaff? How do you cut through any of that? These old records, these were people who they really did earn the title of audio engineer. These were people who we kind of get caught up in the mythos of the album making process because we see things like that. But like I've had conversations with engineers, and like these were people who were like very particular and very analytical and very scientific in their modality and their approach. Nowadays, we see a lot of engineers, they're less akin to that, and they're kind of almost like the equivalent of like vibe coding and coding. They're kind of like vibe engineering, which is not necessarily always bad, but we did lose that almost scientific process to engineering. And we got a lot of great records because the musician was allowed to just be the musician. The artist was allowed to just be the artist. The producer was allowed to just be the producer, and the engineer was just allowed to be the engineer. Now everyone's wearing a bunch of different hats all at once, and there's a lot of information to parse through. So to the skeptics between like, oh yeah, we had a great sounding records back then. It's like, well, we had bigger teams back then. We had more people. People had their own lanes to really approach and apply their own knowledge and modality into creating this product at the end of the day. Versus now where it's like everyone has to wear every hat. So for them, I say like these mid-side linear phase EQ and all that stuff, these are just an evolutions of these workflows and processes that engineers back then were doing. Hell, think of back in the 60s and 70s. Some of the most ubiquitous equipment that we are using today in our studios, some of the most ubiquitous like a Fairchild, an LA2A, Pultex, even the Neve console, even the stressors, anything else, like these were all things that were built out of necessity, or like if Bill Putnam building it just because he wanted to achieve this effect in the studio back at Abbey Road in the 60s, they're building bespoke like technologies and consoles and outboard gear just to fit. And like these are scientists. This is just the engineers themselves making it because they wanted to solve a solution. We're thankfully in an era where we have access to so many tools and so many different like processing power and like abilities to really split the signal both spectrally in different ways that, again, it's just an evolution. I find that we are very much stuck in the past in a lot of things in terms of music engineering. And a lot of people who are really pushing the zeitgeist forward are the ones who are being a lot more successful right now. So to them, I always just say, like Bob Katz always said, like, never turn your back on digital, never turn your back on these new technologies that are happening. Think of him, he's 86, or maybe it's like mid to late 80s now, and he's still a student, has multiple Grammys, wrote the literal book on mastering. And he's always pushing the envelope forward. He's doing linear phase EQ. He's doing mid-side stuff. He's doing high level stuff. He's not just stuck on the ways of how things were done back in the 70s and 80s. He's always been a forward thinker and a forward innovator, but that's, again, also why he's so ubiquitous in our field. It's just to keep an open mind, keep an open thing. And again, at the end of the day, we are delivering a product. We're delivering a piece of art. We have a high honor to be working with artists to deliver something that did not exist functionally before. And it is our job as the engineers to help translate that art form. And even as a bedroom producer or as an engineer who's probably listening to this, what I recommend is don't be afraid to learn, and don't be afraid to go find more esoteric knowledge out there, because that's how you'll grow, and that's how you'll make things that will beat the competition and just rise above.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your point of back in the day there being many experts as part of the team. And now we
Yeah.
definitely have had to try to be the expert in everything, which makes it much, much harder to really be an expert in anything. So yeah, definitely I can see your argument there. And yeah, that definitely valid. Yeah, so it's very interesting because one of the first things you talked about was how learning mastering has passed on to every other stage of what you do. And yeah, you shared some great examples of like different production techniques. What else would you recommend then? Like as far as like, because you mentioned a laundry list of things at the beginning of like these can cause problems in your production. So, I kind of want to go back to some of those because I think that like anyone who's listening to this is probably now panicking like, oh shit, I got to pay way more attention to my phase and all this stuff, right? So what other tips do you have there, whether it's maybe like arrangement things or suggestions or stuff like that that can help with the phase correlation and making sure that everything comes out even. So the mastering engineer really has nothing left to do.
Yeah. So in terms of composition, when you're going to double track something or when you're going to voice something, you don't have to play the exact same chord or the exact same voicing on just one principal instrument. Maybe spread the voicing between different instruments. So we see that already, like at a baseline level where everyone will play the root on their bass element, whether that's the synth or the guitar or bass guitar, and then they'll have the rest of the chord voiced on the guitar or the keys. But it's like, okay, well, let's look at how we're voicing those chords on those upper elements. So maybe we have a more open voicing on the synth, which is just a wider spread voicing, but that leaves more room frequency wise and composition wise for the guitar to maybe be a little bit more closed voice in that. And then now when they come back together, they're not even clashing compositionally. And even frequency wise, you'll go to the mixing stage and be like, I really don't have to do a lot to this. I think a lot of the issues do stem from how we're voicing chords. And I think the lost art of applying like practical theory, back in those earlier recordings, like everybody who was in those session musicians, all that stuff, even the engineers, they did have a baseline understanding of like music theory and an application of it. Nowadays, people are kind of just guessing around. But I would tell them really experiment with those voicings. Like, hey, maybe my synth is more in the C3 with the guitar. How do I spread that C3 voicing? Maybe go make the synth more in C2 and 4 and leave the 3 range a little bit more open so that guitar can just pump right through. Or maybe that vocal or whatever it is in your genre that you're doing. Composition can really save how things will fall down in the mixing stage. Same thing with production. I have this thing I like to call production theory, which is just how do we create a whole song and how do we put these elements in the same way we think of notes in music and chord voicing. So instead of just chord voicings, it's like production voicing, or like, how do I stack this in this way that makes more intelligible sense at that time? And Ian Kirkpatrick has a lot of great videos about this on YouTube, as well as a couple other YouTuber engineers out there. But genuinely, you always have to think moment by moment. You almost have to approach things like a director at times when it comes to your composition. It's like, okay, like if everyone's screaming at the top of their lungs all the time, I can't hear everybody. All right, what if it's not just about like turning people down? It's like, okay, what if this drops out and this has room here? Oh, but again, synth and guitar, they're in the same range. Okay, cool. Make the synth wider in terms of voicing, and the guitar can stay narrow right here in this field, especially if it's playing like a staccato note. And we'll be like, wait, that sounds so much better. And you just apply that further and further down the line. And again, it takes practice. I'm not expecting everybody to go pick up their Theory 1 books and be able to understand that, but like just spreading things out or fitting things in and creating dynamic contrast in the composition, that's a game changer. That will make your productions just sound from amateurish to a lot more professional. And then further downstream, you get to the mixing stage, everything's in a different register. You're not reaching for EQs as much, and you're not doing as drastic of pushes or cuts because, let's say again, back in C3, if everything's back in that same register, your EQ moves are also going to be relatively in the same register. That's going to cause a lot of spectral masking, cancellations, phase issues. There's a whole gamut of issues that can run in, or a whole gamut of problems that can happen. So,
yeah, it's funny. Like I was doing a mix review for someone recently, and I was listening to it. I was like, oh man, this mix is so thin. Like, what's going on? And like, it's like, do you even have any bass in this track? Like, what's going on? He's like, yeah, I played it, but I played it like up on the neck because it was more comfortable to play there. And I was like, dude, that's why. Like, just play it lower. Like, you get more of that fullness off of the bass. Like, little things like that can really go a long way. And I think that like sometimes it's just like musicians lean into like comfort or speed just to get things done faster, and like that can definitely put your mix in a corner as far as like what's possible with it. And I think thinking about it the way you talked about at the beginning of like every instrument having its own space in the mix and the kind of like core frequencies of that instrument throughout the whole spectrum across all the instruments. I think that's like, once you start thinking about it that way, it makes it so much easier to figure out like what is the priority and what can change, what should be in a different range, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, great tip there. So as far as like mastering, then I'm kind of bouncing around all over the place here. There's so much stuff we could talk about. But as far as mastering goes, like when you take a track that from someone who hasn't considered all of this stuff, and now you're presented with a new session. Like, what's your normal mindset going into a new session? Like, what's your process look like as far as like, what are you listening for right off the bat? What steps are you following? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so when I intake on a new master, I'm going into it with a complete blank slate since I'm kind of going more from a QC side. We'll do a preliminary listen. When I'm doing that preliminary listen, I'm just asking like some of the questions I'll ask myself is, hmm, does that feel like I want a little bit more of that coming out right here in this section or in general? Huh. I feel that these two elements are really fighting to just grasp for air right now. Bigger thing is even the bass. The bass, I'm just like, okay, I feel the bass a little bit, but it doesn't feel cohesive and it doesn't feel like unified completely in the end. Or even with the vocal, it's just like, okay, the timbre sounds good for the verses, but when it gets to the choruses, we're losing a lot of when the vocal stacks come in. Maybe it just feels a little too thin. Maybe it's just like, okay, that kick emphasis gets lost because now this new element came in and now we're getting masking from the upper partial of the kick and the mid partial of whatever. So I'm usually just doing a full listen through, taking notes and really trying to break down the things where I'm like, oh, that I'm losing almost that emotional depth. I'm trying to apply a technical answer for. So it really can depend after the fact, after that critical listening, like whether or not I'll ask for a mix revision or if that's something that we can fix. I have a lot of specialized tools that can re-emphasize and actually dig into the weeds and do relative corrections at some levels, but like there's certain things where we just got to reapproach the mix and go back to the mixing engineer. We see that a lot with bass elements. Like there's only so much things you can do to it. Like, yes, so I can use Basslane Pro to help make sure that I'm not only just keeping the compatibility, but I'm also keeping the width and depth. There's things by Noise Bud where we can actually do an intelligent like flipping of the bass, the whole sub-regions and like that whole part of that Carnegie charts rotation to get a better peak level so that we have a better loudness maximization potential for down there. But there's times where it's just like, okay, we have to reapproach this and go back, especially with kick and basses, where it's like, hey, maybe we need to get a better side chaining and a better balance right then and there. We have tools like expansion. I use DMG's multiplicity a lot. It is things I can do in there, but it is really hard at times, depending on the material, just for the mastering engineer to just quickly redo everything. We are not miracle workers at times, but I think people can tend to forget that. And it really is hard, especially when you're getting a lot of new material where it's going to actually translate and if it's going to work back on our playback systems, because we're dealing with laboratory environments at the end of the day and really deep critical listening. Does that kind of answer your question? I kind of like was
Yeah.
jumping between a
Yeah.
couple of other ideas in my head.
No, it's all good. Yeah, like my question was just really like, what are you mainly paying attention to at the beginning of a mastering project? And I think you answered that pretty well. And it's also interesting because I think with what you said, you brought up this idea of sometimes having to go back to the mixing engineer and doing revisions. And I think that that's also just like it's kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier about learning mastering first and how well that translates to like understanding how to make a mix better too. So it all goes hand in hand. So then once you've got kind of your list of things that need to be done, like what's processing normally look like for you? Like what's normally in your signal chain?
All right. So usually in my signal chain, I'll kind of give you a little bit of my secret sauce. If there's any dynamics processing, I do a two-stage dynamics processing. It kind of informs from this modality I picked up from Bob and Matt, where it's better to have two dynamic processors working a little bit than one dynamic processor working very hard. So if I need the great density back in the mix from a master, I'll reach for like Leap Wings Dyne 1 and very low ratio, just a little bit parallel in its center side mode or in its left right mode in the master quality filtering. I can re-add back that density back into the mix. If I'm dealing with my like again the EQs, I tend to reach for equilibrium the most. Equilibrium just seems to be the best digital tool that I have. I also have some outboard processors that I'll use, like the NIF Soma and the Porter Grinder at times, but honestly, equilibrium kind of covers most of my bases. When it comes to the limiters, I do two-stage limiting. So I have one limiter that's kind of working more on the RMS, my more averaging level, and then I'll have a faster limiter, which will be my final stage limiting. My first limiter will be at -0, and I'm only aiming to hit that around maybe like at maximum 1.2 of gain reduction, and it's hitting at 0. And it's a little bit of a slower release on that one, on those. I think it then goes into my second stage limiting, and my second stage limiter is going to be I have my ceiling at -0.8 and relatively faster. And what that's doing is it is reintroducing that dynamic and like that dynamicism and creating that envelope back into the peak itself. But it's also maximizing my loudness potential because it's again, we'll see people just reach for Pro L or one limiter and like they'll slam it just to get that loudness. I'm slowly working my way back up to the loudness and I'm doing it in a cleaner way. And when I deliver, everyone's like, oh, it's not only just sounds loud, it just sounds so much more full and like but you still have all the dynamics and intelligence that and all this like detail in there. And it's just because we're not rushing our way to loudness. We're doing it step by step by step by step. And hell, if I'm dealing with like electronic music genres that need to be extremely loud, like I'll reach for a clipper for my limiters and I'll do a pre and post emphasis of that clipper. And what that is clippers react very fast to high energy sources. Bass has a lot of high energy. So it's usually the first thing that's going to get clipped. The problem is that it'll inflate the bass to such a level that it kind of just unfolds the whole mix. And now you just have this overly like subby or overly bassy track. What we do is pre our clipper, we'll do a little bit of a low shelf and we'll just like maybe from 200 downwards or maybe 100. It just depends on the material. I will, slowly just do maybe like 6 dB maximum and like between 0 and 6 dB roll off, you know, loosen that bass so that way that clipper is reacting a lot more to those mid and high frequencies and it's clipping more of those instead. And then post the clipper, I'll reintroduce equilaterally back that bass. But now that bass is clean, but everything else sounds a lot more glued and more higher energy because of the clipper, and there's not as much peaks. And that way I can hit my limiters and I preserve all that bass and infrasonic information and maximize my loudness at the same time.
It's really just about like understanding the pros and strengths of each tool in the chain from the sounds of it,
Yeah.
and then knowing, what is going to be best for this application, and then how do I make it work best with this other tool that's going to complement it. So it sounds like that's
Yeah.
kind of what your chain looks like there. So it almost sounds like you have quite a big chain for mastering, but it's all very intentional.
I like to say I have a big toolbox for mastering. There are certain tracks that I'll get where I'm not really doing a lot on them. If the mix is really well done, I will never say that you will never need to not go to a mastering engineer. I will say that there are times though where I will get tracks where I am not really doing anything other than like either running it from my outboard, running it into my limiter or limiters, depending on the material, and maybe just doing very small marks. But every situation is different. Like earlier this week, I got to track the master, and my chain was relatively anemic versus like 2 weeks ago, I got a different master that I had to do. And like I was really deep in the weeds with that one, really going in, fixing all these issues. And you just never know. And I feel like where mixing and producers will kind of fall into the chain trap. From a mastering side, it's all about the tools. It's all just about like what is the right tool to fix this issue. We're kind of one of the only industries where it feels as though we're more attached to the tool than the craftsmanship, which seems to be a lost art.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like it's one of those things where I think that the longer you get into this, the more you appreciate all of the little tools that you have and the differences between them, right? It's like as a guitar player, when you're learning guitar, like, you just want to play a couple chords at the beginning and play a song. And then years go by and you start to appreciate the difference between a Strat versus a Les Paul, and all of these different tools and how they're different from each other, and why one's better for one style of music versus another. So it's the same thing when it comes to understanding all these tools, and I think it just takes some time to practice and listen intently and learn these tools and see where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, like it kind of reminds me of like something I had heard you mention, which is that like I believe you were on another podcast and you were talking about how you feel people tend to rush through the process of learning. And I agree
Yeah,
with that. Like I think that so many people just want to get their music done, especially like, a lot of people listening to this are working on their own music. So it's just about like output, so they'll use presets, they'll use templates, and they're just trying to get stuff done, but they're not really learning the tools. Whereas I've heard you say that sometimes if you want to grow quickly, you have to learn slowly. And so maybe you can elaborate on that a little
exactly.
bit.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a natural reaction, especially in our fast-paced world that we live in nowadays, and how fast music is dropping and art is dropping, and it's just everybody wants to move really fast. But in order to move fast, you have to start slow. We have this tendency to really try to rush through our productions and rush through our art, especially in our current like high-speed age that we're living. Uh, that just in the pursuit of trying to get things out very fast, we're introducing a lot more mistakes and issues that had we gone slow and actually like taken time to learn the tools and learn what we have at our disposal to, better get our translate our art and translate our message, we would by going slower where we have the ability to go faster later on. We are one of the few places where we'll want to go on a sprint first. We just want to sprint, get it done, get it done, get it done, get it done, got to release it, got to follow this release track, all that stuff, and that's where people fall into the preset trap, because the preset can just get you the sound that's like a little bit closer than what you probably could have done just by learning the tool, and it's just like, oh, I just want to get it done and just want to get it delivered. That's fine for certain aspects, but if you want to make and if you want to be greater, there is no shortcut to learning. You have to take the time to learn your tool sets. And with some of the students and some of the people I talk to, I cannot want your learning more than you do. And they come to me asking for production advice and like all that stuff, and they're kind of just looking for a preset. And I'm like, there's really not a preset to it. And the more you understand, the more you learn about our craft and our field, the more you're like, okay, while there might be some small, minute generalities that you can do, there is a no one size fits all solution to anything that we do. The same moves that you've done for this person may not be the same for the other person. I see that a lot with vocal chains. People like to go onto YouTube or go on and be like, oh, I got this vocal chain that I developed quickly. Does your voice and my voice sound the same? It does not. That vocal chain may fit for one person's voice, but it may not fit for another person's voice. And now you're introducing a lot of over processing or maybe deleterious processing that really should not be used for that material. But we're not looking by like a situation by situation like workflow, because we're just so used to the one size fits all workflow. That's where going slow is going to be so important. My favorite thing that Bob and Matt has ever done to me was always stop me and ask me why. If I would be sitting in the mastering chair, just learning back in 2018, just trying to do a master, Matt would just ask, like, why are you doing that? And at first it's like you're sitting there sweating, like, am I doing something wrong? Everything else like that. But what the time and experience that came with that, it was just like they wanted to just know why am I reaching for that? Can I explain why I'm reaching for that? And I feel like with a lot of producers and engineers, while you're in the process of doing this thing, ask yourself, why am I boosting that? Why am I doing this process? What is my intended goal? And just having a little bit of the slowdown in your thinking about it, I mean, in your application. And then sometimes in that slowing down, you realize, like, wait a minute, I feel like there must be a better way I can do this. Hey, I really like how my kick drum sound and an isolation with the whole subgroup, but then with the snare and the drum and the rest of the kit, like it's starting to sound anemic. Okay, I'm gonna go high pass everything else that's not the kick drum. Okay, why am I high passing everything else but the kick drum? Oh, so I'm leaving frequency room for that kick. But now my drum sounds still a little bit thinner now because of all that high passing. Is there a better way I can do this? Maybe I can reach for when the kick happens, it maybe multi-bands onto the overheads or onto the room, and it just does a really dynamic, really quick duck of those frequencies so that spectral masking of that kick can come through and that upper attack can just come right through. But then it goes back to normal when the kick is not there. Huh, now I still have that full sounding kit and that kick is not coming through versus just me just trying to do a high pass. Or maybe sometimes even the high pass might be a little too drastic. Maybe I need to do a low pat or sorry, low shelf. But again, that comes with slowing down because now you can really intelligently think about the solutions. It's just something I feel very strongly that a lot of engineers and producers and even self musicians really need to do. I know there's a lot of information and I know there's this tendency to want to rush it, but it's like, slow down, really look at your tools, look at what you have at your disposal. Even just say, like, this is the problem. Even thinking about writing out this is the problem I'm having with this mix. What is the solution for that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a big difference
Yeah.
between doing this for output and doing this for quality. And it's fine. If you need to get stuff out of the door quick, that's fine. But you have to realize that you might be sacrificing quality in the process of doing that. So if you want to learn and be an engineer and do this on a professional level and get your tracks sounding the best they can, like you have to be willing to put in that time to make these decisions and to be thinking about it the way you talked about. You know, that's a big reason why I do this podcast is like, I don't really care about the gear that people use. And I don't care if so-and-so use an 1176 with the fast tack, slow release, whatever. Like, it's like, why did they do that? You know, what were they hearing that inspired that decision? To me, that's the more important thing to hear. And that's really the thing that when you start asking yourself those questions, you get better and stronger. And you end up becoming much faster in the end because you've got this problem solving strategy in your mind of, you know, how to get through a mix faster and what the problems are and identifying these things faster and finding the solution faster and all that. So it's going to be a slow grind at the beginning if you want to do this at pro level, but you're going to be much faster and better in the end because of it. So yeah. So with that said, like as a mastering engineer, how long do you find it typically takes you to master a track these days?
Usually my range is if it's around 20 minutes, if it's really well mixed and produced, to sometimes I might take me maybe 2 or 3 hours, and that's with an ear break. Because my threshold for tolerance is probably around 45 minutes before I need to take an ear break. But it really just does depend constantly. And it's one of those things that lately I've gotten so used to just fixing these problems and being introduced to them that I can just kind of go for a mastering session within probably within that hour time frame per song, depending on it. Or, I'll probably know in the first 5 minutes if I reach for this, okay, maybe we have to go back to a mixer version. But it really does depend. It just does depend on the song.
Yeah. But even I think that's a pretty good range. Like, you know, anything from 20 minutes to an hour, I think it's pretty good. And like you said too, your first instinct is going to usually be the biggest thing that needs to be fixed in a mix. So it's like if you go to adjust your tools and they're not doing the job, then sometimes that is the sign that a mix revision is what's needed, and you know what to do from there.
No, it's okay. Sometimes you have to go back. Sometimes it's like instead of fighting this thing, it's like maybe all right, go back to ground zero. And for the master, that's like going back to the mix. Or if you're self-producing and you're just like, I can't get this thing to sound right, maybe it's just restart, refresh. Yeah. Instead of fighting to try to push through that, sometimes it's just, hey, let's go back and let's just redo it. And sometimes it can be frustrating. Sometimes it can be demoralizing. But sometimes you might just find a better way to do it. You just might find a better way. And it might, instead of having a chain that's 8 to 10 different things, maybe you realize it just needed to be 4 things. Maybe you're overcomplicating it. Maybe you're just, you got really in love with this idea of it sounding like this, and you were throwing everything at the wall for it. But now it's like you'll start taking things back. There's been plenty of times where I was just like, oh, I got to restart this whole thing. And I started bypassing plugins back in my early days. And I was like, wait, this sounds a lot better. Oh, I was just over processing.
Yep. I think there's something to be said for just like muting or bypassing plugins for sure. It allows you to kind of see where you have maybe gone too far, or what's contributing the worst to your mix, or whatever the problem is. So sometimes, yeah, when you feel like you've reached that point where you're just like, I'm going backwards, sometimes just a simple bypass is the easiest way to identify that. How do you ultimately know when you're done with a mix? When you're done with
I know when I'm done with a mix. Let me answer that separately. With a mix, I know I'm done when I'm reaching a threshold listening wise where I'm like, if I start going into like the mastering level, like minute, like if I'm doing a tenth of a dB or 0.5 dB like adjustments, I should be done. It's also when I play it back and the emotional resonance of the track is still hitting for me, where I'm not being distracted by the technical things that are happening. It's all about the emotional things where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm getting like that frisson or those goosebumps that are kind of happening. That's when the mix is kind of done. But the master, for me, it's really a whole different like shift in my brain where it's a little bit more technical, where it's just like, okay, I can listen to this and I don't hear a problem. I don't hear too drastic of a problem where I'm like, I need to stop this right here, right now. It's almost like picking up the needle and being like, all right, fix the bass, fix the mid frequencies, re-expand out a little bit of this and that. When I'm just sitting there being like, you know what? I think this works really well, and the loudness, and it's passing all my checks, and I'm looking at my Lizard meter, and everything's looking perfectly fine, and I'm not worried more about the technical in that sense. That's how I know it's a good master.
Yeah, I think you basically summed up both sides of it. Like there's that gut reaction and feeling part of it, and then there's the technical side of it too. So yeah, I think that's a great answer. Awesome, man. Dude, this has been great. I've loved learning more about your approach to this, and you could tell that you're very meticulous with what you do, and you approach it from a very technical perspective instead of, just kind of rushing through things. You actually put a lot of care into the work you do, and it's great to hear.
If I can wax poetic for a second.
Sure, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
One of the downsides of learning mastering first before mixing and producing is that I became very technical at first. And I've been in this wonderful journey of the process of unlearning to like just learning to let go from all of that. Before I started doing music in general, like there was this innocence that I had towards music production and music and like just listening for the sake of enjoyment. You go do mastering, you're only just listening. You're always on. You're always just like, oh my gosh, like that could have been done a little bit differently. Oh my gosh. So man, that's going to be like, this is such a basic track. Like, I don't know if this is going to, when it goes to the cutting engineer, how they're going to really align that to be good, or like, you're always in this overanalyst mode. And it's just, it can just take a lot out of you. And I've just been in this process of just, hey, I don't have to go into the weeds. I don't have to go into doing all these finite details. I can just enjoy it for the sake of enjoying it and like dumb it down a bit, just dumb it down ever so slightly. And funny enough, I felt like my career took off more the second I started letting go of all those technicalities. Matt and Bob are scientists. They're probably the upper echelon of scientists when it comes to our audio field. And learning from them, there was a part of me that really wanted to join in that. But now there's a part of me that's just like happier where I am, where it's like I can go back to the common musician, the common engineer, and I can take these high level concepts and provide it down to a more comprehensible level. I don't have to worry about like infrasonic and hypersonic balancing and talk about all that stuff. I can just say like, hey, let's do this instead. Let's do this instead. And it's been a beautiful journey.
Sure, man. It is always that balance. And I agree with that, like unlearning side of things. It's like when you start, you don't know anything. So you just feel it. And then you start to learn a little bit more of the technical side, and you go really deep in the weeds with that. And then you start to realize like what matters and what doesn't. Right. And it's that's one of the reasons why I was so like curious early in our conversation, like talking about all this phase correlation stuff, like that's stuff that a lot of people like would just go over their heads, right? So it's like kind of getting to the core of like how much does that matter? And it obviously matters, but it's like how much emphasis do we need to put on that? And ultimately in the end, like what's going to make the biggest difference in a track? Yeah, it's cool.
Exactly.
Like I love learning more about this technical side of things, and helping the audience learn more about this as well. And there's a time and place for it for sure. And I think you've explained like that it is important, and people do need to pay attention to these details, but also focus on the music too. And when you get to the feeling and all that, that's going to be a really big part of it too. So yeah, been awesome, man. Dude,
Yes.
Dude, thank you so much for coming on here today. I really appreciate it. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you can reach out to my studio Monotheory at monotheory.org. You can hit us up on the contact at monotheory.org. You can follow Hacienda Mastering on IG and on their website. And for me personally, you can follow me on my IG, which is /Shane. Reach out. We can see if we can have room in our schedules to kind of work it out. I've been doing a lot more immersive mixing now, especially for Colombia. That's been kind of the primary work orders from them. So, hey, I'd love to come back out here and talk about Atmos and spatial at some point, because that's been such an eye-opening experience for me, seeing as now we're doing a lot more work in that. And there's a lot of misgivings about the medium that I would love to clear up for the public.
For sure. It's such a new technology that there's so many, it's the Wild West in a lot of ways, but there are people that are like in this day in and day out who have kind of learned how to make the standards that I guess we need to adhere to and understand it better. So yeah, definitely at some point, dude, it'd be great to have you back on.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you again for having me on.
So that was my interview with Shane Slack, and I loved how he went really deep into things like phase. Something that we don't talk about a lot. Like obviously when you're checking like overheads and stuff like that, we talk about phase, or snare top and snare bottom, or two mics on a guitar amp. Like we talk about phase in those kind of situations. But then thinking about it in terms of how all the decisions that you're making in the mixing stage are affecting phase correlations and balance and translation and all of that kind of stuff. That's something that we often don't dive deep enough into, but it plays a really important role. And so to hear from someone like Shane, who is mastering records and constantly thinking about issues like phase, I think it's a really good reminder that we need to always be mindful of how every stage of the production process ties together and how all of the decisions that we make affect the next stage down the line. And when you learn all of the different stages, recording, editing, mixing, mastering, it really informs all of the decisions you're going to make the next time so that things become easier. Like I've said before, that like if you record things once and then you start to edit, when you edit, you're going to learn some of the things that you should watch out for in the recording stage to make sure that there's less work to do in editing. And then when you mix a track, you're going to see how the amount of editing work that you did impacted the mix, and how if you've edited things to make things tighter, you're going to create more space between the notes, and how that makes masking issues easier to deal with in mixing. And then, when you learn to master, you learn how things like phasing in mixing are affecting the translation factor for the master. So every stage informs the previous one, but also allows you to go through that process in this cyclical way where you just constantly get better and better. So, I think it was really interesting to hear Shane talk about learning from the last stage of the process and how it has this massive trickle-down effect on all of the previous stages and what he does in his work. And I thought he shared some great examples of some of the things that you can do to make sure that you're double tracking your instruments properly, or you're thinking about the arrangement side of things properly, so that all of those decisions make everything else easier. That's what this is all about, right? Yeah, I know that in some cases, this stuff can get pretty technical and pretty nerdy, and some people might have tuned out hearing all this talk about phase, but it's important. And if you don't factor it in, you're really shooting yourself in the foot later on when you have to pass it off to someone who now has to deal with your mess, or you don't even know that you have these issues and you end up with something that just doesn't feel right, doesn't sound the way it should, or doesn't translate the way it should. So it just really emphasizes the importance of learning all of these different stages and how they all come together. And like he talked about, these days we have to often be the person who is doing all of it. Long gone are the days where there's budgets and people can afford to hire a producer, an engineer, a mixing engineer, a mastering engineer, and have all of these different experts in their field. So, if you're working on your own music, you need to decide, do you want to go that route, or do you want to be the person who is going to do your own recordings and get it to the highest quality level? Because if you are, then you got to learn this stuff, right? So yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting chat with Shane, and I thought that he brought up some awesome things to factor in as you're working on your track. So really grateful for him to be here. Now, with that said, like we just talked about, it's super important to learn every stage of the production process. And in many cases, like we talked about here, learning this stuff can be a slow grind. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of mistakes you're going to make along the way. And you can certainly learn this all on your own, and it will just take time. But if you're the kind of person who is impatient, or you just want to get results faster, the best way to learn this stuff is to learn from someone who's ahead of you and who has this experience and who can point out the things that you need to be aware of as you're working on your tracks. And that's exactly what I do inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. In that program, I'm working one-on-one with my students to help establish what their vision is for their music, and then guiding you with all the decisions needed throughout the recording, editing, mixing process, and mastering as well, and really understanding what tools to be using, what to be listening for, what workflow to be working in, how to organize your sessions, how to work faster, more efficiently, all of these things, so that ultimately in the end, you end up with a simple, repeatable process that you can use for all of your songs moving forward. And so you can mix more confidently, record more confidently, and just trust your process a lot more. So if you're someone who wants to learn this stuff, if you're someone who wants one-on-one help with your music to get it sounding as good as you can, as fast as you can, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. That is a page where I have the outline of my program. And on that page, there's a link where you can book a call with me. I'm offering free calls right now. I'd love to learn more about your music, what you're working on, what your process looks like right now, and to see if I can identify any gaps in your process that maybe you should be focusing your energy on learning and strengthening. And with that, you can choose to take it and run with it on your own. Or if you want help and it seems like I can help you, then we can talk about it on the call. So once again, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And like I said, it's a free call. So click on the link. There's a booking calendar. Book a time that works for you, and we can go from there. With that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.